I want to welcome you all to our annual lecture. We don't do this lecture just for the sake of it. The idea is to celebrate the memory of Bernie Grant. For me, one of the great politicians in this country. And for me, somebody who, frankly, not to put too fine a point on it, would have been kicked out of the Labour Party in the current leadership, which for me is probably a mark of honour, to be honest. Because what Bernie would have done is what he always did, which was speak truth to power. And what he always did was to tell the truth about the situation facing people of African descent in this country, but not only in this country, but across the world as well. And that, for me, was always one of the great strengths of Bernie, was that he wasn't just a great local politician, as he was, but he was also a great international politician. But part of being a great national politician isn't just about me. It's about bringing people together internationally, and I think that's what Bernie was really great at. So tonight's event is about celebrating that fabulous legacy. Every year we invite an eminent person to come along and to share their expertise with us. We've had some great speakers over the years, and tonight is absolutely no exception to that. We have the brilliant academic, Professor Hakim Adi, with us this evening. Professor Adi is one of the foremost experts for me in Pan-Africanism, in African history. One of the foremost acts in this country, not just around African history, the first black professor of African history, if I've got that right, yeah, in this country. But for me, one of the most informative academics, not just because of what he writes, but also because he's engaged in the community as well, because he's engaged in the work as an activist. And that, for me, is critical. That the academy doesn't get separated off from the people, because I think when it does, that's when it starts to be a problem for us. So Professor Adi has some, I'd be here all night if I was to explain all the publications that he's written. I think we've got some on sale this evening that I hope Professor will be able to sign for people as well. But I am absolutely delighted to be able to invite you to make some real noise for Professor Hakim Adi.
So first of all, let me say it's a great honour to be asked to speak here before you tonight. I'd like to thank the Bernie Grant Trust, Sharon Grant, and all those involved in presenting me with the invitations. I say it's a great honour to be here. Thank you all for coming out on a Thursday evening. I think it's a Thursday? Yes, it's Thursday. Yeah. I'm sure there are all sorts of other exciting things you could be doing, but I'm very pleased that you're here with me tonight. Of course, there are many celebrities in the audience, perhaps too numerous to name, but I thank you all for coming. Some of my students are here, friends are here. Many people in the audience that I know. If I don't know you, please come up and introduce yourself afterwards. I met a very nice woman as I was coming in tonight. She said, I'm sure I recognise you. What's your name? And I told her my name. She said, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, I thought it was you. So anyway, I'm very glad that she's here. So what I want to do is to, it works, is to say something about this important subject. And I'm going to take you back in history to a time, let's see, where are we? I think exactly 31 years ago today. Isn't that a strange coincidence? And 31 years ago today, Bernie Grant made a very famous speech, which you can easily find on the internet. It was a speech that was made in many places, but on this particular occasion it was given in Birmingham. And it's generally referred to as reparations or bust, but it was a speech about the need for reparations in general. But one of the features of that speech was and is that it utilized history throughout as the, if you like, the evidence that Bernie presented to support the case that he was making for reparations. Now, I've just taken two quotations from that to kind of guide us on the journey I'm going to take you on, or hopefully going to take you on tonight. And you can read them for yourselves, so I don't need to read them for you. But these are, we can say, two of the reasons why history is important for all of us. There may be other reasons, and we can hopefully explore some of those other reasons tonight. So, first, yes, our history has been distorted so as to deny our achievements. Now, I thought I would start this survey in Africa. Where else would I start? And this is a well-known monument. Some of you will be familiar with. It's quite a large monument. As you can see, it was so large that I couldn't take a photo of it, being relatively close to it. And I'm not going to talk about the history of this monument in any great detail, but what is interesting about the history of Egypt, of ancient Egypt, is that it's still something which is a little bit controversial. There is a history to the history of Egypt, and it's a history which has been and is still being denied. And the essence of that denial is an attempt to present the view that, well, first of all, is Egypt in Africa? Some people try to allege that it's not in Africa, that it's floating around somewhere in the Mediterranean. Secondly, if someone presents a map and they're forced to admit that it is and was in Africa 6,000 or 7,000 or however many thousand years ago, then they say, oh yes, well, it's in Africa, but those people who were responsible for creating that great civilization were not really Africans. They came from somewhere else. They came from the Mediterranean. There are various theories. When I was at university a very, very long time ago, they had something which they called the Hamitic hypothesis, which they used to explain the civilization of ancient Egypt. And in fact, many of the civilizations that developed in Africa, were explained by way of this Hamitic hypothesis. I won't bore you with the details of it, but basically the idea or the thesis of the Hamitic hypothesis is that these Hamites were essentially Europeans who went around Africa civilizing it in ancient times. And so if you found any developments in Africa's history, it was due to these Hamitic peoples who never existed. It's a complete nonsense. But this theory and other theories like it still persist. And even though the evidence is there for all of us to see, and of course the great monuments and the great civilization of ancient Egypt was built by Africans, by Egyptians, who are Africans. But even today, there are difficulties, a struggle over the nature of this history. And of course, also the influence that Egypt had, not just in other parts of Africa, but also in various parts of Europe. When you're at school, for example, you learn something called Pythagoras' theorem. Pythagoras being a Greek mathematician. Well, of course, everybody knows that it wasn't Pythagoras who developed that theorem, because Pythagoras lived a very long time after the pyramids were built. And anyone who builds a pyramid needs to understand not just that theorem, but very advanced mathematics and so on. So this is an attempt to deny that the civilization of Egypt, civilization of Africa had any impact on Europe, and in fact on all the developments that took place in ancient Greece and so on. Anyway, that's a long and involved argument that I won't bore you with. But this is one of the problems that we continually face. That where even though there is evidence, even though it is obvious to nearly everybody that Egypt is a great civilization which arose out of Africa, there is an attempt to deny that such a thing was possible. And of course, there are very obvious reasons for that, which we can explore as I go along. Of course, there are many other examples in African history. This is from northern Ethiopia, the great civilization of Aksum, from the early part of our era. And before I go into that, I should just mention that one of perhaps the greatest achievements of ancient Egyptian civilization was its longevity. So we are in the year 2024, or 2024, if you like, of our era. So our era is just over 2,000 years long or old. So Egyptian civilization was longer. It's a civilization of roughly about 3,000 years. 3,000 years before our era started. So this is the immensity of that achievement of Africans. And how was that civilization sustained for 3,000 years? Anyway, that's a very long and complicated subject, but just imagine that span of 3,000 years. And of course, that civilization of ancient Egypt sprang from earlier developments within the African continent. A common culture that stretched across which is now the Sahara, all the way to what is today modern Ethiopia. So this is immense history. Their attempts to just eliminate it, to say it came from somewhere else. So Aksum, another great civilization. I suppose that this is, the obelisks are the most famous representation of it, but it was a civilization that in its time was known as one of the great 4 empires in the world. That was its prestige was so high, its importance was so great. And of course it led to other important civilizations in that part of the world that I haven't got time to go into tonight, but I just thought I'd start off with that. And then we come a little bit closer to home, we could say, in the sense that both in time, because this is a 14th century map, we can say a European map, one of the first European maps of the African continent. And right at the center of this map of what's essentially West and North Africa, you see a king. And the king is decked out in gold. And this is an early representation of one of the great West African empires of Mali, which at that time was reputed to be one of the wealthiest places in the world. And some of you will have heard of one of its most famous emperors, Mansa Musa, who went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and on his way he passed through Cairo, as well as many other places. And it was said that he took so much gold with him that the value of gold plummeted on the international currency exchanges of that time. So this was the enormity of just one West African empire. And of course it was news of this gold, which was so rare in Europe at the time, that eventually encouraged European explorers to try and find the source of this gold. And we have to remember that in the 15th century, when Spanish and Portuguese began exploring and so on, they came from a position of weakness, of lacking various things, particularly bullion, and knowing that other parts of the world had these things which Europe didn't have. And of course their aim was to get hold of those things and use them for their own benefit. Anyway, that's another history. So these are just 3 examples. Obviously there are hundreds of examples that one could take from this history, which is very often denied to us in school, in university, wherever it might be. We are presented with a rather distorted view of the African continent, its place in history, and so on and so forth. And that's to our detriment, because history is not just about the past, but also about the present. And therefore, we get a distorted view of the world in which we live. And that is a very dangerous thing. Now, of course, when one looks at the history of the African continent, because of the way it's been presented in the past, very often from a Eurocentric perspective, there is a great effort on the behalf of those who try and present the history of Africa to present great kingdoms and empires, as I've just presented them to you. But of course, as everybody knows, or perhaps people don't know, these great kingdoms and empires had their internal difficulties, their internal problems. I suppose that's often summed up in the phrase that the pharaohs didn't build any pyramids, that pharaohs didn't do any work at all. The pyramids were built by other people. Now, what were these other people like? What were their lives like in Egypt, or in Axum, or in Mali, or in these other places? Well, that's one of the most intriguing questions that we need to ask ourselves and understand. And so I thought I'd use this example of this gentleman. His name, I think his birth name was Shambu. He came from what is today Ethiopia. He's better known to history as Malik Ambar. And Malik Ambar was essentially we can say a political leader, a prime minister, really, in India. And so you might be thinking, how did somebody born in Ethiopia end up in India? Well, unfortunately, he was kidnapped and enslaved, as many other people were, from the region of what is today Ethiopia, and transported. And actually, he passed through various owners during that period, and ended up in India, where he rose through the ranks and became actually a very important personality. And there were others. He's not an isolated example. There are other examples. Because even in ancient times, there were people who were kidnapped and enslaved in Africa and taken to other parts of the continent or other parts of the world. We have to recognize that, generally speaking, where these states exist, kingdoms, empires, that usually means that some people are in a state of being exploited. Because in order for pharaohs to exist, somebody has to be growing the food for them, mining the gold, building the pyramids, doing all the things which those who are ruling are not doing. And these divisions in society existed in some African societies, not all, but in some, just as they existed in Europe. And in some of them, there were enslaved people, and in some of them, there was human trafficking of these enslaved people to other parts of the world. And that's a big subject, a big topic. But I thought I'd just mention it in passing. Okay. So I thought I'd move from Africa to Britain, just as William Answer did in the 18th century, good-looking young man. And William Answer had a doting father. He came from what is today Ghana in West Africa, and it was the tradition at that time for some wealthy fathers in West Africa to send their kids to school in England, usually their sons to school. And William's father was no different, and so he sent William off with a trusted companion, or emissary, actually a sea captain, and said, take my son to school in England. And William went off, and unfortunately it turned out the sea captain was rather unscrupulous, and he kidnapped William and took him to Barbados. And in those days, as you probably know, people didn't go to Barbados for holidays, but they were taken there to work as enslaved people, enslaved Africans, and that's what happened to William. Now, William's father was, as I say, very doting on his son, but rather less doting on other people's sons and daughters, because it so happened that he himself was engaged in human trafficking. So, and this is where we come to perhaps the second quotation I gave from Bernie's speech, that history also throws up uncomfortable truths about the world in which we live. And in this particular case, William's father got in touch with his business partners, and they went by the name of the Royal Africa Company. And they were called the Royal Africa Company because it started off as a royal monopoly. As you probably know, the business of the monarchy from the 16th century to the 19th century, the main business of the monarchy in this country was human trafficking. That was what they did. Every monarch from Elizabeth Tudor to William IV were engaged in that activity. So William's father got in touch with the Royal Africa Company and said, look, unless my son is returned to me unharmed immediately, there will be no more human trafficking from this part of West Africa. So of course the Royal Africa Company are rather dismayed by this turn of events. They immediately sent their emissaries to Barbados. They found William. They liberated him. They brought him to London, gave him this rather nice suit of clothes. He was accommodated in the house of the government minister responsible for human trafficking, who had the title of President of the Board of Trade. He was taken to the opera, taken to the theatre. His portrait was painted. A biography was written of him. He became a fashionable man about town. He had a nice holiday for quite a long time. And then eventually he was taken back to his father. Father said, that's great, thank you so much. Now human trafficking can recommence between them. So this was the nature of the relationship between Britain, its monarchy, its rulers, and some similar rulers, we can say, similar people, rulers in West Africa in this period. Now, without going into how that relationship developed, that relationship certainly existed because Britain and the other European powers were not strong enough to go to Africa and kidnap people themselves. They had to have collaborators in order to do that. So this history is important to present, and in fact the context of it is even more important to present, because I'm not presenting this to say there shouldn't be any repair. In fact, quite the opposite. But one does have to understand the relationship that exists, just as today a relationship exists between the governments of Britain and the other big powers and various governments in Africa. And just because there are collaborators in Africa doesn't mean there isn't a need for repair. In fact, there's a very big need for repair, particularly within Africa itself. But that's another subject. So history gives us many examples to assist us, to demonstrate to us not just what is hidden or what can be hidden, or many unpopular, unfortunate truths, but also that there are those who take action, who stand up for what they think is right. And one of those was a gentleman called Olaudah Equiano. You may have heard of him, or Gustavus Vassa, who was a writer, wrote a best-selling autobiography in the 18th century, was an abolitionist in that he campaigned with others against human trafficking, and also was an early Pan-Africanist in the sense that he created or was part of an organization called the Sons of Africa, one of the first Pan-African organizations we can say in existence, certainly in Britain, made up of other Africans who found themselves in the diaspora generally through being kidnapped, as Equiano was. Equiano freed himself as the others did. So Equiano was a campaigner, and of course we used to learn about abolitionists just being people like William Wilberforce and so on. And then we learned there were people like Equiano and other Africans who were perhaps much more important in that struggle against human trafficking. But what we don't generally learn about is all the other people in Britain who were engaged in that struggle. And I want to show you a part of a letter which was written by a man called Thomas Hardy. Now, Thomas Hardy was a friend of Equiano's or Gustavus Vassa. In fact, Equiano lived with Thomas Hardy and his wife in their house in London. And here is a part of a letter that Thomas Hardy writes to somebody who's been introduced to by Equiano. And in it, we get an expression of, we can say, 18th century British politics. Because he says to this gentleman, I understand that you are for the rights of Africans. I therefore assume from that you're also for the rights of man, generally speaking. Rights of man being human rights. Rights of man was the phrase that was used in the 18th century. In other words, if you're for the rights of one section of the population, you must be for the rights of all. So this is a very profound politics. Some people, even in the 21st century, haven't got to this level of political understanding. Now, Thomas Hardy and Equiano were members of an organisation called the London Corresponding Society, which was such an important organisation it was banned by the government as being subversive and revolutionary. And it grew out of a movement of working people in this country. And it was central to the struggle against human trafficking in Britain, which was one of the biggest political campaigns ever in Britain's history involving millions of people up and down the country, working people, enlightened people, women, you name it. Everybody who was anyone took part. It's so big, perhaps as I say, the biggest in Britain's history, that nobody ever learns anything about it. You never hear anything about it in school or university or TV or anywhere. And you can draw your own conclusions as to why that's the case. I usually tell an anecdote at this stage, but I've told it so many times, you probably all heard it before, so maybe I won't tell that tonight. All right, well, for those who haven't heard, you fell into that one. Well, yes. So 2007 was the bicentennial of the Parliamentary Act for the Abolition of Human Trafficking. And as you may recall, those of you who are old enough to remember, 17 years ago, hardly seems possible it was 17 years ago. But anyway, there was a big thing about it, the government were behind it. And it was presented as, and it wasn't presented as part of this mass campaign of working people in Britain. It was presented as something Parliament did in 1807, because the British Parliament is the mother of all parliaments and enlightened and all this sort of nonsense. Sorry, can I say that? Yes. So, anyway, I remember speaking to a young teacher, young English woman, and we were talking about this history and so on. She said to me, you know, it's very difficult to teach us all this history. So I said, really? Is it? Why is that? She said, well, you know, one feels so guilty. I said, really? No, why do you feel guilty? She said, well, you know, one's ancestors were, you know, enslaving people and so on. I said, really? Well? Now, I said to her, look, your ancestors were probably signing petitions against human trafficking. They were probably boycotting the consumption of sugar in their tea and so on. It's much more likely that's what your ancestors were doing. So here was somebody teaching children history. They knew nothing about the history of this country, and was going around feeling guilty about something that was the responsibility of the monarchy and their friends. So this is how history, or distortion of history, is used. So everybody loves the monarchy, or is supposed to, and hates themselves. So what's the point of that? Well, of course there is a point. I'll lead you to draw the conclusions as to why history is often presented in this distorted way. Now, speaking of people fighting, of course we also have to remember that perhaps the greatest blow to human trafficking in that period, the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, was the struggle of enslaved Africans themselves. In fact, and not just enslaved Africans, but Africans generally, because we shouldn't forget that people fought against human trafficking in Africa itself. But certainly those Africans in the diaspora, those who were kidnapped, also waged important struggles, and none more important than those revolutionaries in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, today Haiti, who fought for 13 years to liberate themselves. And in the course of that struggle, they defeated the three principal armies of Europe, the French, the Spanish, and the British, and declared their new republic, Haiti, the first modern independent African republic. Yeah. And as you know, ever since, that independent African republic has been under attack, first from the French, then from the US and others and their allies and so on, until we have the situation that we have today in that country. where in fact the US and its friends are doing all the best they can to re-invade it, again, having created havoc. So when we understand history, and we can look at the whole history of Haiti since 1803, 1804 onwards up until the present time, we can understand exactly what's going on in that country and why it has the problems it has today. But we cannot deny the revolutionary struggle of those people in Haiti. And you know that at the time they rose up, the average life expectancy of an African in Haiti was 7 years. So it's a remarkable achievement. And of course, there's so many questions that you can ask about how they did it. What language did they speak? How did these Africans on different parts of the continents organize themselves, stay united for 13 years, overcome all these obstacles and so on and so forth? So this is a great act of heroism. And of course, in ushering in the new republic, they also gave the world the first modern definition of human rights. They say everybody is black. Doesn't matter where you come from. French, you'll be Polish. Everybody's black and everybody has equal rights. So this is more advanced than the French Revolution, more advanced than the American Revolution, more advanced than... So it's, anyway, a very important struggle, and it created a major blow against human trafficking internationally. It's not for no reason that 4 years later, the British Parliament suddenly says, oh, well, we changed our minds about this human trafficking. We're thinking again. Because they recognize if they kept importing fresh revolutionaries into the Caribbean, what had happened in Haiti would happen in other places, and the whole system would be destroyed. And so to avoid that, and because they could gain an advantage, because you know Britain was the world's leading human trafficker. To such a degree, they not only imported or exported, however you want to look at it, Africans to their own colonies, they exported them to everybody else, all their rivals as well. So they argued, well, if we stop this, if we stop enslaving Africans and stop all our competitors, then we'll have an economic advantage because we've got more enslaved Africans than they've got. And there are other calculations as well. I won't go into it all now because it's... But it's not that the British Parliament was enlightened. I know you didn't think that really. But... So these struggles to change the situation are important, and they give us another clue as to the importance of history and why it's so vital to affirm this history. That it's not something that can just be ignored. Understanding this history is understanding the history of the world in which we live today. And so it's very, very important that we're aware of it. So talking about people who struggle, I have to be careful what I say here because I know there are various political people here, but this gentleman was William Cuffing, and he was one of the leaders of the Chartists in this country. And the Chartists were the first national working class organisation in Britain. They're called the Chartists because they had a chart of 6 demands, and those demands were all concerning political rights. And what was the problem at that time was that in Britain in the 19th century, most people didn't have any political rights. Certainly didn't have the right to vote. It's interesting that the same political system that we have today existed then. I just thought I'd mention that. In other words, the two-party system, representative democracy, all that kind of thing existed. But people just didn't have the vote. Now, of course, we have the vote because people like William Cuffey fought In fact, they fought for much more than the votes. They fought for annual parliaments and all sorts of other things as their demand. But these were important struggles for which people paid a price. He himself was arrested and imprisoned, in fact transported to Tasmania, as were many others who took part in those struggles in the middle of the 19th century. So we have to remember that even those rights that we have today, limited though they may be, were the result of the struggles of people in the past. They didn't just arise from nothing. So history teaches us all of these things. And of course, one of the other things that we need to affirm is that, as well as affirming that Africa and its diaspora are important in our understanding of the world, we also have to affirm that women are important in our world. And in our history, in our understanding of history. And again, just in the same way that there have been attempts to remove Africa and Africans from history, there are also attempts to remove women from history and from our understanding of history. Now this woman is very, very important. Her name is Alice Kinloch, and she was the woman who, we can say, inspired what today we call Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism meaning the united struggle of Africans and people of African descent for the liberation of Africa, for the liberation of themselves, if you like. So she was, people often talk about the fathers of Pan-Africanism, and they mention Edward Blyton, or they mention W.B. Du Bois, or they mention Henry Sylvester Williams, but nobody mentions Alice Kinloch. Alice Kinloch was the mother of Pan-Africanism. She was originally from South Africa and came to Britain in the 1890s as a campaigner on behalf of the rights of her compatriots. And while she was here, she met various activists who were here, including Henry Sylvester Williams and others. And together they jointly formed an organisation called the African Association in 1897. And the African Association was set up essentially to bring the voices of Africans, people of African heritage, together. And it was that organisation that convened the first Pan-African conference in London in 1900. So history, just as I said, just as history is made up of people from all parts of the world, not excluding Africans, so of course it's made up of all human beings, and obviously that includes women. Okay, now I never like to give any presentation without talking about Tottenham. Yeah. And as we're in Tottenham today, I've got an even better reason talking about the great Spurs. Yeah. And this is Walter Daniel Toll, who was, as I'm sure nearly everybody knows, one of Tottenham's greatest players. But for some reason, he's not known in history for that reason, generally speaking, important though that was. He has another distinction, and that distinction is that he became an officer in the British Army during the First World War. Now, why is that noteworthy? Well, of course, history was presented to us in such a way that the First World War, even though it's called a world war, was presented in such a way that nearly everybody was excluded from it, unless they happened to be in Europe.
That's right.
And so people resisted that Eurocentric vision of things. They said, well, hang on a minute, what about the Africans? What about the Indians? What about this and that? So, and in Britain, people said, well, what about Walter Daniel Toll? And others, many others like him. He was unusual, as I said. He was the first British-born black person to become an officer in the British Army. And the reason why that was unusual was because at that period in the 20th century, there was a colour bar in the army, meaning if you were not a person of pure European descent, you could not become an officer. But because he was such a well-known sports person, footballer, he breached that colour bar and unfortunately was killed in action, the Second Battle of the Somme in 1917. Now, as I say, these days we like to celebrate these individuals who participated in wars and so on. But we sometimes don't actually look at the history of the wars. And, oh. Thank you so much. I did actually, but thank you. I hid it. I think we better give an applause to Esther. Thank you. Yeah, I hit it. Yeah. So yes. So we tend to celebrate. We make a big deal of, yeah, Walter Daniel Toll and so on, without thinking about what was the nature of the war. So I'm going to just show you this taken from another individual during that period. This is Isaac Hall, who was a Jamaican carpenter and was what are generally referred to as a conscientious objector. In other words, he refused to be conscripted, for which he was arrested and imprisoned in Pentonville, tortured, nearly killed for the stand that he took. He gives his explanation as to why he didn't participate in that war. And it is, in my view, quite a good analysis of what was actually going on. A much better analysis than that given by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. He said it was all about the beastly Germans, which of course it wasn't. And this division of the world continued after the war. And those who won the war, principally Britain and France, redivided the world in their favour. And that redivision occurred in Africa, and it also occurred in a place called Palestine, that you may have heard of. And so again, if we look at the history, this history, it helps our understanding, as I say, of the world in which we live today. Now, I mentioned Isaac Hall being one resistor, but I can never speak about the First World War without talking about the great John Chilembwe. And this is John Chilembwe. John Chilembwe was a clergyman, essentially, in what is today Malawi, who opposed the war and said, why are you British, it was a British colony of Nyasaland, forcing Africans to participate in it in various ways? It's nothing to do with us, we don't want to be involved. And he organised a rebellion, which was savagely crushed, and he was executed. Now, one of the great national heroes of Malawi, find him on the banknotes and so on and so forth. A very, very, very interesting man. I haven't got time to say more about him. But anyway, I thought I'd just mention John Chilembwe, if you didn't know anything about it. Okay, well, I'm going to move from one war to another because of time constraints. I mentioned the colour bar in the First World War, but then what about the Second World War? Well, the Second World War, there was a colour bar as well. And the history of racism in this country is an interesting one. Of course, one doesn't want to say too much about it in the sense that the history of anti-racism is also very long. And it's very often important to say more about that. And this is an example of both, I suppose. Amelia King was an East Londoner who tried to join the Land Army during the Second World War and was barred from doing so, while her brother and father were in the Navy and so on, risking their lives and so on. This was common during the Second World War in the armed forces as well as in the auxiliary services. But you'll see that this is part of a protest, this leaflet, condemning racism during that period, people organising, trade unionists and others, and eventually she was given a place in the Land Army. It's just one example, but that history of anti-racism is very important and is often neglected in the way that the history of this country is presented. Now, of course, there are other important figures that one could talk about who also struggled against great odds, who made their contribution to the life of this country, and we could say are important to affirm within this history and to speak honestly about them. And I'm always intrigued how Claudia Jones is described in so many different ways, but never described, certainly by the powers that be anyway, when they put her on a postage stamp, and never described as a communist. But I mean, that's what she was. Anybody who was anyone at that time period was a communist. And so this is also an important aspect of history, that we understand the politics which inspired or drove people to do the things that they did, to go to prison, to battle against ill health, to keep going, to get deported, to come here, to do all the things that they do, and so on and so forth. That's very, very important. And to understand that role that communism played, communists played, the international communist movement at that time played, not just in Britain, but in Africa, in other places. Anyway, that's another subject. I won't go into all that now. So some of this history relating to Britain I tried to squeeze into a little book, which is, I understand, available for you to purchase, should you wish to do so, at the end of our session tonight. I thought I'd share this quote with you. This is from last year. We may or may not agree with all of that, but I thought it was an interesting one from the General Secretary of the UN. And the concluding statement is that the most powerful weapon in our arsenal against all of this is education. Education. But if we look at the education system in this country, we find all kinds of problems. We haven't got time to go into all of them. But one of the problems is the way that history is presented or misrepresented in schools and universities and so on. To such an extent that young people, especially those of African and Caribbean heritage, are turned off history. Some of you will remember in 2020, during Black Lives Matter and so on, one of the things that the young people said when anybody asked them was this issue of history, as well as all the other things about police and racism in general and so on. The issue of what they were taught or not taught in schools in particular, but also in universities. And this is a photo of the History Matters conference, which was held, 9 years ago this month. And we held that conference to try to understand why there were so few, particularly young black historians in this country. It was originally provoked by a newspaper headline that said only 3 black students trained as history teachers the year before. That's secondary school history teachers in this country. Now, if you know anything about how many history teachers there are, they're about 16,000. I'm not sure exactly how many now, but at that time about 16,000. But of those 16,000, only about 230 were of African or Caribbean heritage. And that particular year, only 3 black people trained to be history teachers. So myself and a few others thought that was rather alarming and couldn't understand why nobody was doing anything about it. We began to look into some of the statistics because it was clear that not only were there very few teachers, there were very few people studying at university, certainly very few postgraduate students. So we began to look into the figures, and we found that at every level of education, young black people turn away from history. So even those who get good grades at GCSE don't go on and do A-level, most. Those who do A-level don't go on and study at universities. Those who do study at universities at undergraduate level don't go on and do any postgraduate or so on. So at every level people are alienated. And so we decided to hold a conference and find out what's going on, even though we kind of guessed what the answer might be. So we held this conference and we invited young people, students, school students, undergraduates, postgraduates, if we could find any, and teachers, and said what's going on. And essentially, in a nutshell, there were lots of things that were going on, but the main thing what they complained about was Eurocentrism. They said we are fed up, all we ever hear about is slavery. We never hear anything else. Some people said that that's all they were taught every year they were in school. Some people said they had to reenact slavery in their schools and so on, all kinds of horror stories. And they said, why don't we hear, anyway, that was the picture which they presented. And so the conference discussed all of these things, and then what could we do about it? What measures need to be taken? I'm cutting a long story short, but that was the essence of it. So one of the things which, well, actually I forgot, we used this picture. You know what that is?
Is that 2 St. Louis shirt?
That's pretty good. Yeah, it's depicting 2 St. Louis shirt. Who's the geezer on the left?
It's the French bloke who conned him out of Haiti.
No. Good answer. Completely wrong. It's actually the British bloke. It's a British bloke who got defeated and is surrendering. Yeah, this is General Maitland, or it's a surrender of the British Army, essentially. Anyway, I just thought I'd show that in because it was on the. So one of the recommendations of that conference was these people said, well, we need something for young people to encourage them to engage with history, some kind of scheme and so on. So we established right after the conference in 2015, we established the Young Historians Project with some of the young people who actually had spoken at the conference. And, there we are. I thought I'd show an ancient picture. This is, anyway, some of the members of Young Historians Project. They've all gone on to do greater things, of course. You know the gentleman in the middle? Winston who? Trim. Who's he then? You know the story of the Oval 4?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No.
No? Who said no? I don't know if I've got time to tell you people are leaving already. Okay, so the Young Historians Project still going strong. We have some of its members here tonight. And essentially what they do is they develop their own history projects. and then they do research and they present them to their peers, you could say. So it could be in the form of a documentary or an exhibition or an e-book or podcast or whatever they want to do. And the first project they did was about the Black Liberation Front, of which Winston Churchill was a member, was connected with in that period of the early 1970s. So that's why they were interviewing him. The other thing which the conference suggested was that it would be great to have some qualification for older people who loved history but had been alienated from studying it. You know, they'd been put off at school, but then they kind of discovered it later in life and so on and so forth. So we set up the MRes at a university I won't name in the history of Africa and the African Diaspora in whenever it was, 2018, something like that. Quite a while ago. And as a master's program. So anybody could come, you didn't have to have a first degree, didn't have to have any degree actually. As long as you were keen and you were literate, essentially, we would take you on the MRes and train you as a historian, train you to do research, train you to write, and that's what we did. And in whatever it was, 5 years, 6 years, we produced, I don't know how many graduates exactly, but 7 of those who graduated from the course went on to do PhDs. 1 has already got her PhD. 5 are still trying to be at the University of Chichester. The University of Chichester is making it very difficult. And 1's in the US doing a PhD there and so on. And they all end. So that's what we did and established. And it was the only course of its kind in Britain, in Europe, in the world, completely online. You didn't have to come anywhere, you just come home from work or wherever you were, and anyway, we set it all up and so on. And it was set up specifically for mature students, and particularly students of African and Caribbean heritage. Not only, but geared towards it. So it did what it said on the tin over that period. Now, as some of you know, I know, good-looking young man, as some of you know, the university that I won't mention for legal reasons decided to abolish that course last year. And then told a whole lot of lies about it. I have to be careful what I say for legal reasons, because we've got a whole row of lawyers here. Actually, I should just check, are there any lawyers here representing a university that I won't mention? No, nobody's admitting to it. So then the university told a whole series of lies about what had happened. So one of the lies they told was they said there was only one graduate, or there weren't any graduates. I can't remember exactly the enormity of the lie, but anyway, it's along these lines. Even though the previous year, these are just 3 of the graduates at the graduation ceremony pictured with a good-looking young man. So these were complete lies. Were told to try and discredit the course, obviously to try and discredit me, and also to discredit the students who were still on the course or had completed the course and graduated, and some of whom went on to do PhDs. And some, or one who's in this picture is here tonight, if we need further evidence. So, as some of you will know, the students were outraged about what had happened, because as well as affecting the students who were currently on that master's program, the university then used the closure of that program to get rid of me and say, oh, well, the course isn't running, so then we don't need you anymore. Now, without going into a long story for legal reasons, it's extremely unusual in a university, when a course is, in fact, to use the university's term, suspended, the university said it hasn't closed the course, it's just suspended it. It's unusual when that happens to course that you sack somebody. So the kind of assumption was, that one draws from that, is that this was just a kind of ruse, that the suspension of the course was used as a way to get rid of a professor and to disrupt the studies of all the students involved. And as I say, not just the students on that course, but also the PhD students who I supervised. It was about 10 or 11 PhD students as well. So, as you see, various things were said in the press. I was invited on various programs. A whole campaign was developed involving the students and other people, supporters. We launched, or a petition was launched, which I think eventually got something like 15,000, maybe over 15,000 signatures, people from all over the world. And now there is a whole legal campaign as well, which I won't go into in detail for legal reasons. And we're encouraging people to donate to that crowd justice campaign. I'll put up a QR code later that everybody can do that. So this is the situation that confronts us. We have a situation where this history is very, very important. In general, it's being denied to everybody. It has a particular impact on people of African and Caribbean heritage in this country. A course is established to try and address that problem. It's very successful in what it does, and the university then closes it down, and then tells lies about what it's done and why it's done it, and so on and so forth. So this is the situation that we're presented with. And just to give you a bit of context, in my academic career, I've only had 2 posts. And in each of them, I've been made redundant. Because I taught at Middlesex University. I taught on a program which was a kind of, we can say it was a kind of Black Studies program. It wasn't called Black Studies, but that's in essence what it was. A university closed it down. And then just not satisfied by doing things by halves, they closed down the entire history department. And I was the last historian at Middlesex University. So then, anyway, without going into it. So we could say if I was, let's put it this way. We could say that this history, which is so important, is under attack. Some people have described what happened at the university I won't name as a thinly veiled racist attack. Difficult to argue with that. Very difficult to argue with. And this is why I say there's the necessity to continually affirm this history, the history of Africa and the African diaspora. It's attacked from the perspective of Eurocentrism. It's attacked from the perspective of hiding it and distorting it. And when courses are established, when students are produced, that is attacked as well. And so there's a continual need for this affirmation. It actually requires a struggle to defend and affirm this history. It's not like, the history of the Tudors or something. Nobody attacks the history of the Tudors, I'm aware of, maybe they do. But this particular history of Africa and the African diaspora is attacked. It's attacked in the US, it's attacked here, it's been attacked for many, many years. I started off by by presenting to you what Bernie said, or some of the things that he said. And I want to end with another quotation. And thank you for your attention. And this is a QR code for those who need it. If you want to find out more about what's going on and you want to donate, just stick your phone on there, take a photo thing and get straight to the side.
Bit more noise, I think. Okay, so the good news is you've not got to listen to me for very long. That's the really good news after that superb presentation, I think. Yes. I mean, I kind of think of myself as knowing a lot of this stuff, but there's a load of stuff that was presented there that was really new for me, but also opened up a lot of thinking about different courses of different avenues that I want to kind of consider a little bit more as well. I was saying to the professor earlier on that one of the reasons I was so unhappy about the Chichester course, am I allowed to mention? Well, I am anyway. One of the reasons I was upset about the course closing was because I was really interested in going on the course, actually, because I thought it was such a good course. Anyway, what we're going to do now is we're going to have a panel discussion, not led by me, but it's going to be a radio presenter of great renown, Dotan Adebayo. There he is.
I don't come here as a radio host. I come here first and foremost as a person who grew up in Tottenham, somebody who's been a fan of Professor Adi's for nearly 20 years now, since I took my film cameras to your house in Leighton, I think it was. And we had a long conversation, spent most of the evening there indeed. What I thought of, first of all, and both of you, feel free to answer this question as well. I felt from what Professor Adi has said is that we've dodged a bullet, because as wonderful as your groundbreaking course is or was, I don't think Black history is safe in Chichester University's hands, do you?
We've seen it at Goldsmiths with their MA in Black British Literature and Black British History as well, which have been threatened. We've seen the same thing happen at my undergraduate university, University of Brighton. The hands-off the Humanities 25 members of the Humanities Department were threatened with redundancy around the same time that New Perspectives, Hakim's recent anthology, was being published. We launched it. One of my own professors whose job was being threatened, who was at our very book launch and who's written a chapter in that book, was also being threatened with redundancy as well. So I'm not really surprised, if I'm perfectly honest. The other course that was in the Humanities Department at the University of Chichester, run by, I think, Dr. Dion Georgiou as well, of Cypriot and Guyanese heritage. His course had been threatened, the BA in Modern History, and it's specifically these courses that are teaching underserved histories that are being threatened and always the first to be pulled.
Why is it happening? Professor Adi was a bit reluctant to get into that for legal reasons, as he stated, but why do you feel that it's happening?
What is?
Yeah, I'm also not supposed to say certain things. So I'm going to try to be really careful with my words, but I think, as Hakim mentioned, there are about 11 PhD students in the cohort, which is, we believe, to be at least one of the biggest cohorts of Black history postgraduate students in the UK, if not the biggest. All of us are doing really important revolutionary research on the history of African and Caribbean people, not just in Britain but globally as well. So it's that promise that we all have, where we could take it, the kind of information and knowledge that we could spread is, I think, to certain minds, a massive threat. And so that is a part of it.
Because you are taking the course forward, aren't you? You're a PhD student yourself,
Yeah.
and you've written a book as well.
Yeah, so I published my first book last October, and that was... And that was about Gurlin Bean, who I'm sure many of us in this room know, a great black feminist activist who was based in Britain and Jamaica and in Zimbabwe as well. So she's a great example of a radical black activism that that was produced in Britain. But not only that, Hakim mentioned also, when you have these courses within universities, within traditional academia, you do also need the alternatives as well, the alternative spaces like the Young Historians Project, which is very much a community organisation where any young person who's interested in history can join, learn skills that you don't even get taught at university. So you learn how to use archive material, you learn how to conduct oral history interviews. All of those things, generally speaking, you're not exposed to when you do go to university. So there's always, Hakim is a great example of not only do we need to push for bigger spaces within academia, but we also need to carve out spaces in the community as well. And so we're always going to continue doing that. YHP has been going for 8 years now, and we just keep going from strength to strength, and whatever challenges we come across, we won't stop.
My journey started from a really early age. I went to an extremely white primary school. I'm from a very, I think about 95% white area. Like, my hometown's deeply conservative. MPs, since I can remember, has been Damien Hines. I won't go into that too much. And we were one of few mixed heritage families there. I'm of Jamaican descent. And yeah, I always loved history as a kid. My dad always loved history, especially, and really encouraged me to like think about studying it in the future. So yeah, I'd always, in primary school, there was always this one book. There's only one book that covered anything to do with black people, and it was a really short kind of like storybook on Martin Luther King, and I got it out every week in year 5 and year 6 constantly. We'd go back home on the family PC and like Google his sermons and speeches and things, so we talk about it quite a lot in our household. But yeah, got through to secondary school, didn't learn niche about black history, not even US history either, which is always kind of represented as. Even when I got to college, when I did history, I dropped it after a year because I had very pro-Empire, pro-Winston Churchill teachers, and I really, really struggled with that. You kind of struggled to see yourself within it as well. So yeah, when I got to undergraduate, I was lucky in that one of my lecturers was an Irish communist, total legend. So she was down, she was very down. And I had the pleasure of actually coming into contact with Hakim prior to sort of maybe thinking about a master's degree, and he offered to come along and speak on a panel that we were hosting on decolonising the curriculum before it was all the rage. And yeah, from that point, I was like, this is a really kind of affirming conversation that I want to be part of. I've always wanted to be part of it, but I didn't really know how. So that was how I first got introduced to the course. And specifically, even at undergraduate, I didn't know that much about Black British history either. Again, it was very globalised. A lot of it was very much focusing on US-centric narrative. And when it wasn't, it was often sort of conversations of black literature here and there that had cropped up sort of in 19th century. And that was kind of it at my undergraduate. Unfortunately, my lecturers were very limited in what they could teach us and what they could put on the curriculum, even though we had critical traditions and Western thought as a module for 2 years. So yeah, I think I was really, really keen just to find out more, and the MRes was the best way possible for me to do that. And without it, I wouldn't really be doing what I'm doing today with young historians. I was able to jump on a traineeship with the Runnymede Trust. Some of my lovely colleagues are here today. But without Hakim's course, I wouldn't have been able to do any of that. So yeah, that's my journey.
Yeah, I think my personal journey has a lot of parallels with Hannah. Like Hannah, I also grew up in a very white white community, very middle class. When I went to school, the only thing that I was taught that was related to Black history was your typical Martin Luther King story, and a little bit about Malcolm X, but that he was kind of a bad guy and we should focus on Martin Luther King. And so, unlike a lot of young people of African and Caribbean descent, I was actually inspired by the fact that I'd had such a kind of traumatic experience of history at school. When I got to the stage of going to university, I thought, well, actually, I want to know more about what I don't know. And so I started to research university courses out there. Came across Hakim, who was doing excellent work at Chichester with courses and modules that focused on the history of Africa and the diaspora. And so I studied with Hakim at undergraduate. Loved most of my time there. I was going to say every second, that's a bit of an exaggeration. And then when I finished my undergraduate, at this time I was also working with the Young Historians Project, and I got to know about amazing people like Zainab Abbas, who's in our audience with us, who was one of the leading members of the Black Liberation Front. I'm sorry to embarrass you. And when I finished my undergraduate, and this is the point about Hakim and him being such a mentor figure, not only for us, but for people in the audience and so many other people, is that when I finished, he said, "Where are you going? You're doing your PhD." So I'm still doing my PhD, but it's, without that encouragement, I would never have embarked on that journey. I didn't know anyone in my own circle who'd ever done a PhD before. I didn't know what it entailed. So there's no way that I would have gone on to do that if it wasn't for his encouragement. So big up, Hakim.
It feels, though, Professor, as if that is your interest group there. When people say that young Black people are not interested in the history. No, we all have a different journey. We all get to it in one way or another, but I don't see any reluctance from either Hannah or Amelia's journeys about the Black history per se. How do we harness it, if you like?
No, I mean, what I was explaining was that there's an alienation from history in general, because the kind of history which was presented to young people excludes them, excludes people like them, and excludes Africa, and excludes the African diaspora, and so on. But let me tell you a little story. This is not boasting. This is just a true story. When I first went to a university that I won't mention, I established a first-year course for undergraduates on the history of Africa and the African diaspora. So it was a very basic survey course. It included Africa, the Caribbean, the US, and Britain. And the university that I won't name is, at that time anyway, was a very, shall we say, very monocultural university. In fact, it was one of the most monocultural universities in the country, about 92%, I think it was at that stage. I had a class, so this class on the history of Africa and the African diaspora, I had, 50 or 60 students, all white students, came to that class. So at the end of that, that was my first semester at the university. At the end of that semester, the end of that course, they voted that course Module of the Year in all the courses they'd done at the university. And they said, "We love it. We've never heard this before. We've never done this history in school. Why haven't we learnt about all this before?" Because it opened up new horizons to them because it's about about the world in which they live. How can you be an educated young person or old person and not know anything about the second largest continent in the world, or not know anything about the history of this country, or whatever it is? I mean, some of the things I've talked about tonight. How can you not know these things? Everybody should know these things. So everybody is being denied that history. It's not just black people are being denied it. Everybody's being denied it. None of you ever learnt about the struggle against human trafficking in this country. That was a struggle waged by British people. Some of them happened to be Africans, but the majority of them were not, of course. But it's not spoken about, it's not taught, because if it was, then we'd draw various conclusions from it. And we wouldn't have the situation of the young teacher I mentioned who was going around feeling guilty. So people would have a different perspective on the world in which they live and their place in it. And that's very, very important that we have that. And the quotes I gave from Bernie at the beginning kind of relate to all of us. That our history has been distorted. And he may have been speaking about particular history, but one could say history in general is distorted in ways that have an impact. History can be something which empowers us, or you could say disempowers us. It makes us feel, good and all right about the world. It can inspire us, just certainly if we're told the truth about things. Or it can make us feel, well, I can't do anything about that. What can I do? How can I change anything? And then you go and study something like the Haitian Revolution. Did they sit around saying, well, we can't do anything about that? We've only got 7 years to live. We're never going to change this situation. No, they didn't. They said, let's organise ourselves and see what we can do.
I will turn to our MRes graduates here to get a sort of a sense of both what she's saying about how do we empower our communities, our younger people, and like Professor Adi says, this can be everybody. It can be everybody, people of African heritage or otherwise. How do we empower our communities to take hold, if you like, and build on the foundation that they've already got, that you've got, for example, and that Ayo had there with the Saturday schools? How can we build on that? Hannah?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think Saturday schools, supplementary schooling, we may not feel that it's still going strong, but it very much is as well, as it should be. I know that one of our sort of PhD students, Danny, I know that he's very much involved in the Croydon Supplementary School as well, which he had been for a very long time. But without the sort of MRes, I wouldn't have learned about those specific Saturday schools and how that entire movement started of the supplementary schools as an offshoot of the Black education movement. But again, out of the History Matters conference and the findings of those, without that, we wouldn't have developed things like the Young Historians Project, I joined quite late. I joined when I was maybe 20, 21. But it's an organisation for African and Caribbean young people, 16 to 25. They volunteer their time, apply for funding, but take on projects, learn all these new skills like oral history interviews, like copy editing, like creating documentaries, podcast treatments. I didn't even know what podcast treatment was until 2 months ago. Without programs and initiatives like Young Historians Project, which are built off the back of the traditions of Black supplementary schooling, that self-reliance and that self-help, we wouldn't have these kinds of programs going for younger people as well.
Yeah, I agree immensely with that. I think that the Young Historians Project is an example of many initiatives that are happening up and down the country, and they all serve communities maybe in slightly different methods, using slightly different methods. At the Young Historians Project, we have an ethos, which is a commonly known proverb, each one teach one, meaning that if you possess a certain skill set or knowledge, you have a responsibility to pass it on to other people. And so that's, principle of community learning. So there are all kinds of skills that we share with each other within the organisation. But I do think that it's important to fight for spaces in academia as you know, corrupt and uncomfortable as we know academia can be. It is such an eye-opening experience when actually, well, before certain things kicked off with the university that we can't name, Hakim very kindly let me teach on some of his undergraduate modules. And so I was teaching students, and every time we began the semester, I'd ask them the question, why did you pick this module out of all of these choices? And they said, well, because we haven't had the opportunity to know about this before, so we want to know about it. And everyone has the right to access that history, whether they're at university or elsewhere. And certainly we have to fight for the right to do that in whatever space we're in, I think.
So the problem is that we live in a world where we are not the decision makers overall. Maybe we make some decisions about what we have for breakfast and so on. But the important decisions about the society in which we live, we're not the decision makers. So the kind of history which is presented in schools, in universities, on TV, etc., 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 is presented by other people who do make the decisions. We can say I'm simplifying it. And they present a history which suits their interests. So in general, and in fact we've seen very recent examples of this. I mean, I say only a few years ago, maybe many years for some of you, but for me it's only a few years. There was a gentleman called Michael Gove, and he was Minister of Education. He said, okay, in schools we're going to teach a history curriculum which only includes the white men of property. So it doesn't include women, it doesn't include Africans, it doesn't include Asians, it just includes the white men of property. So in the world in which we live, the powers that be their wish would be just to present that history. And all the greatness is the white men of property. It's the white men of property who did everything. The white men of property who invented everything. The white men of property who civilized everything. That is the history that they would like to present. And of course, that history is a history of a tiny minority of people, even in this country, let alone the whole world. So that is the problem that we confront. And the history of Africa, just to give one example, has, as I started off by saying, has been presented from that perspective. That is to say, either Africa doesn't have any history, and if you listen to the major philosophers of the white men of property, whether in this country or in other countries, that's what they will tell you. Africa has no history. And when there are unfortunate examples of that history, like the pyramids, they say, well, of course, the pyramids were built by white people. There was or they're built by Hamites who are white people, or they're built by a dynastic race who happen to be white people, and so on and so forth. This is the presentation. So, how do we deal with that? We immediately say, let us go and look for our glories. So we fight, as we're still fighting, over ancient Egypt. We say, no, the ancient Egyptians were African. No, the ancient Axumites were African. No, the ancient Ghanaians and Malians were Africans. They built great civilizations. And we've been doing this for, you can go back hundreds of years. People have been saying these things. And of course, there is a battle over these different presentations of history. And of course, we want to know the truth about Kemet, about Tarseti, about Axum, about all of these places. Of course, these things should be presented to people just from the point of view of knowing, yes, kingdoms, civilizations, states existed in Africa. Of course, actually some of the first states that ever existed in Africa. What is a state? A state is an organization of society where you have generally systems of government by some people to govern other people. what do those systems of government do? They allow some people generally not to do any work and to have a nice life, and other people to do all the work for them. And in Africa, we have some of the first of those. We have other societies that didn't have states, didn't have government in that way, were very democratic and so on. In other words, when we look at history, we have to look at everything. What we object to is one-sided view of things, which says Africa had no history, Africa had no states, Africa had no kingdoms, Africa had no civilizations, Africans never did anything. We fight that. We oppose that. That's one thing. That's like the first stage, and we're still fighting that first stage, unfortunately. But then once we've gone through that first stage, then we have to look at other things. Because actually we want to understand everything. We want to know everything. Yes, we want to fight for our glories and for those things which make us feel good. Then we also have to look for those things that help us actually understand the world in which we live. And most importantly, how we're going to change it.
Just as Professor Adi said in his lecture, that these things are interdisciplinary because, you know, we're talking about geometry, which is mathematics, but he pointed out, look at those pyramids, somebody had to work out at the very least, the trigonometry in that, didn't they? And yet it seems like the government or the education board is separating history from, which goes back to the question that we heard there, that they're separating one thing from another. Actually, philosophy, in my own department, one of my lecturers said to me, there is no African philosophy, said those very words to me. And we know in literature that people have been fighting to re-establish African literature, or African heritage literature, if you prefer it. It feels like all these things are connected, and yet they're being separated.
Yeah, that's no African philosophy.
That's what
Never heard of Franz Fanon.
Well, even before that, I was thinking, where do you think Aristotle got it from? Aristotle was a beggar for the bottle. It took some actual people in Alexandria to teach him philosophy. And Alexander the Great said, well, go on then. You teach him philosophy, and then we're going to burn down your libraries so that you can't teach it again. But it's all connected, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think, it serves a lot of the rhetoric that our current serving government have been spreading for years, since the early 2010s, really, with a lot more investment in sort of like STEM schools, as the person who asked the question stated. We're seeing the cutting of like creative fundings for specific councils as well, like Birmingham, for example, also in Manchester as well, even though like it is interdisciplinary, really and truly, the arts. We've got like less than 2.5% of history undergraduates who are of Black heritage. We've got about 11% of our higher education lecturers are people of colour, and less than 1% of them are Black people. And that is purely because of the underfunding of the creative arts. And I think it works in the favour of the government, who are now putting in impartiality guidelines. Look at the Tony Sewell report, for example, saying that state racism, it doesn't exist in Britain. What are you talking about? With this post-racial society, that is a lie. That is pure lies. And it is completely serving what the Conservative, if I'm allowed to say that, what the Conservative Party want to push, to be honest.
The MRes initiative, although it's in danger, it was successful in its aims of producing however many graduates who then went on to PhD study. So we need to fight for the survival of the MRes and also courses like it, wherever they are in universities in the UK and across the globe. The campaign, and again I'm trying to be careful with my words, ever since we launched the campaign back in July, it wasn't just the students, although we played a leading role in setting up the campaign. We weren't the only people propelling it forward. As Hakim said, we had 15,000 people who signed the petition, the majority of whom did so in the first month of the campaign. We had people from the Caribbean, people from Africa, Brazil, all over the world who were fighting with us. So that is a form of collective action, in that anyone who learnt about the campaign and learnt about what the university did to the students and to Professor Adi knew that this was a fight for not only our futures as students, but any prospective students who would want to study the course in the future.
What's the next step? Where do you go from here?
Well, I think that the main thing is that we continue to fight. That's the key thing. There have been various attempts to encourage us not to fight, or to give up, or to do something else. But as Frederick Douglass said, where there's no struggle, there's no progress. So you continue fighting. If there are people who want to join us, it's easy to join the campaign. You've got the QR code there. You can get involved financially. You can get involved in other ways. If people are interested in developing the history, the research into this history, particularly in terms of Britain, we have a History Matters initiative. We're about to organise or about to hold a conference in October, not very far away from here. So if there are any young historians who want to come and talk about their research and so on, we really want to encourage people to actually look into the history of this country, look into the history of African and Caribbean people in this country. That's something else people can get involved in, and they can come to the conference, which will be held at, what's it called?
V6.
Yeah, B6 in Hackney, so I couldn't remember what it was called at the moment. In October, they can come to that. As far as wider problems of the education system in this country, whether at university or school and so on and so forth, those are, to put it simply, political questions about who makes the decisions in this country. Do we make the decisions, or does some other people make the decisions? And we have to consider how we can make decisions, how we can be the decision makers about all of these questions. What is taught in schools, what is taught in universities, what's on TV, what's all of these questions. We're in the 21st century, we're all literate, we've all been educated, we're not back in the 19th century or 18th century, people had no political rights. But unfortunately we live in a society which denies us, claims that it's a democracy, but denies us decision-making powers. So how do we change that situation? We need to hold another meeting to discuss that.
Well, maybe we will.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, what a worthwhile evening listening to Hakim Adi telling us what I think many of us believe, but we need reminding of, that we hear about the history that's written by those in power in our world, and that the reality of history told from below rather than above is what we all need to be looking at, not just black people, but everybody. There are different versions of history from above and below, and what we're hearing about in our universities is the history from above, and what we're seeing in the case of this Chichester situation is an attempt to shut down the history that we should be hearing from below, from ordinary people, in particular from black people globally. So this was a really worthwhile evening, refreshed people's memory, recharged their appetite to continue to having these important discussions. Well done, everybody.
I think today was a great experience. We had a big audience. Everybody clearly very passionate about history, and both understanding history but also making history ourselves. So in other words, engaged in struggle to change the problems that face us in society, whether that's about teaching, about learning, about understanding our place in the world and how we can make history by changing the situation so that we can become the decision makers. So all of these things were discussed. People get very passionate because there's so many problems to deal with in society, and the problem of education is one of them. The problem of how history is taught is one of these problems. So all of this came out in the talk, as well as the need that people have to understand history, to not just be told lies and negative things about Africa and Africans, to be told the great struggles, the great achievements that have happened in history. But as I said, we need to understand all of this history in order to understand our place in the world today, and most importantly, how we can change this world for the better.